Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much. Alexander, thank you so much for your warm introduction. And thank you so much for all of you attending today. It's a beautiful day. I'm sure there's better things to do. So you all are sacrificing something to show up and listen to me. So my topic today is a little narrow one about inequality in Africa. One of the subjects that I work on, broadly looking at the issues of political economy development, and very much focusing on the issue of what I think has become an enormous problem worldwide in virtually every country in the world, and particularly all throughout Africa, which is the huge growing inequality of wealth and income and all of the pathologies that are associated with that. And I'm going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk a bit about where it came from, critique one of the reasons why it's been in some senses tolerated for so long because of the dominance of neoclassical economics, and talk a bit about some of the dynamics of what it's creating it, and pointing a bit towards how to begin perhaps to address the issue. So the topics I'll look at today are African global trends. Africa should be seen in the context of global trends, both in income and wealth. The trends within sub-Saharan Africa. There's quite a bit of empirical stuff on that. Some reflections on the mainstream views of inequality, basically, and some of the other ways of looking at and understanding inequality, wealth, and income, including the impact of structural adjustment, which was huge in terms of launching neoliberalism more widely. This latest phase of the massive increase of inequality of wealth and income. And with it, of course, also the very problematic politics today of austerity, declining standards of living for people, and the move towards populism, populist authoritarianism, or even fascism, as we're seeing in the world. They are connected. And looking at Africa in the context of where it sits within the structures of trade, reproducing and enhancing these dynamics of inequality, and also looking at the issue of finance as well. And so let me begin by a quick introduction. Basically, too often debates about Africa goes between growth tragedy or growth miracle, as I've said, depending upon the years you're observing, the employer of the person making that assertion, and also perhaps the beverage you're consuming. In some senses, it's just been a ridiculous discussion because it misses what, in fact, is really going on in Africa. And a lot of it is also, look, we're the World Bank at one point, as one former senior economist said, look at the great things we've done. Africa's doing well. Well, and then we got into a big crisis, and now then it started doing well again. And now we're back into a massive current finance and debt crisis again in Africa, which has returned as well. And so less has been actually focused on, which is really important, the issue of the distribution of income over this period of time. And what in fact has become an incredibly important issue, which needs to be discussed much more systematically. But one of the reasons this is not discussed is because dominance of neoclassical economics, in some senses, patterns of inequality, well, it's kind of a natural outcome, a positive sign that incentives are in place, things are working well in Africa, people are getting richer, but they kind of deserve it to some extent. Our incentives system are in place. And so basically what we have is less of that kind of discussion. And so what I'll do here is document some of the trends in inequality and wealth, where Africa sits with them, before trying to understand the nature of these trends. So we look at the kind of longue durée of the patterns of inequality of the world. And what we see is, we can see here, basically, the longue durée patterns of rising inequality, and then what was a remarkable period in the post-war period, in essence, some improvements, the top 1% declining their percentage, and then this really very much post 1980s period of rapid rise, both in the top 0.1% and the 1%. But what's of course disturbing in all of this is the continual decline over time of the bottom 50% in income. Incredibly disturbing, really very remarkably problematic. over this period since 1980. We can see that the richest 1%, it's across the world, what's kind of done the worst in terms of the extremes of the growth of income of the 1%. What's that country way over to the right? Oh yeah, United States of America. Possibly one of the most neoliberal places in the world, but it is widespread throughout the world. And we look at the income gaps across the 10% versus the 50%. What's quite remarkable here is how high Africa is. It's not really known to some extent, because so much of Africa, it's got to be fairly equal because it's a low level of development. We'll tell you why there's that myth that's going on. Incredibly high inequality of income, the ratio of the top 10% versus the bottom 50%, 31 to 1. Sort of a growing gap, Europe being sort of the best, but the worst as you head on into some of the developing countries. We'll look at some of these dynamics. We can see here the top 50, 10 to bottom 50, red is bad. It's a very high income ratios. The highest really being in Central and Southern Africa, parts of Latin America, Mexico, and some of the places in Asia, this kind of growing gap between the rich and the poor. We can look at this at the growth, and this is kind of really interesting because what country has the highest growth of the share of the top 10%? This little blue thing is called South Africa, folks. And this was not because of the imposition of neoliberalism by the World Bank. It was their own decision through GEAR to put in neoliberal policies with huge implications of the standard of living. I was just in South Africa 2 weeks ago. For those that haven't been there, we know that the rich live behind high walls with full-time 24-hour security, with barbed wire and alarms, and the poor are desolate, often living in rural areas, very few job opportunities, incredibly high unemployment. The worst being there, but also we see this across the board of the rising share of the 10% in income. We see this in terms of the top 1%, equally pretty bad, again, very rising. So it's not just the upper 10%, the upper 1% have a really rapidly rising income period. Again, what is this period? Mostly post-1980. Again, the rise of neoliberalism. We'll talk a bit about why that is, at least in the Africa context. One can also talk about it elsewhere. And then the bottom 50%, that means they have between 3 and 12% of the income. Yellow is really bad, guys, and a lot of it is in Africa, unfortunately, as well as in some of the other developing country regions. Incredibly tiny percentage of the national income. And we look at kind of the kind of growth over time. This is worldwide. The top 1% captured 23% of the total growth value between 1980 and 2020. Bottom only 9%. So as part of that, it even did that well was because of the arrival of China. Which did see a significant improvement of the lower end. Much of the rest of the world did not share in the same dynamic. And again, the share of the global growth captured by income groups, bottom 50% in Russia. Anybody see that number? Yes, that is a negative sign, folks. So they've gone backwards with the period of the oligarch in the post-reform period. Basically, again, it's kind of across the board. The bottom getting a comparatively small percentage of the growth in places like Russia, in US and Canada, a little higher in places like China. But if you look at the upper 0.001% in Russia, guess what? They got 10% of the growth over that period. That's extraordinary, and it explains a lot of the oligarchic structure in Russia being the worst, and others sort of in varying degrees along those lines. But top 1% in Canada, top 10% still getting 67% of the growth between 1980 and 2016. One of the things we always remember is Gini coefficients. World levels are always much higher than the individual country. This is a bit dated, it's just as illustration. What's above Brazil today? South Africa, sadly. We then look into global trends on income and wealth. What we have here is we have a situation where wealth is much worse than income for obvious reasons, because it accumulates income over time. We can see the top 10% in the world has, yes, that is correct, 76% of all the wealth in the world. I mean, that's really extraordinary. the lower 50%, only 2%, much worse than the income level, basically. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this data, but we can look at the wealth distribution, much worse than income distribution across the board. This is the average income across the world. And, so 31%, Sub-Saharan Africa, the average income is 31% of the world average, 350% in North America. But again, you look at wealth, and it's, what we see is much higher. If you're here, 90% relative, in Africa, only 17% of the global wealth level. And this creates huge problems. From a position, basically, of human security, it means you don't have anything to fall back on. If you're hit by a shock, you have nothing, you have no savings. And that's in the vast majority of countries. What we're seeing now, I just came from Uganda a few weeks ago, and a wonderful paper talking about what's happening in northern Uganda. They've liberalized all of the property rights. So the only thing individuals have if they have a health crisis is their land, and they sell it off, and then they're desolate. And this is happening because they've privatized land, they've privatized education. You want to put your kids through school, it's usually a choice of put my kids through school, hopefully earn income, but in the process pay for the land, because the cattle is not enough. There used to be their form of savings to even deal with the underlying shocks and the costs associated with basic social expenditures. Uganda being perhaps among the most neoliberal country in all of Africa. And so they're just not there to fall back on. It's incredibly low. Distribution of world national income to wealth. Once again, what we see is that you can see the wealth levels are much higher. Average wealth per adult, top 0.1%. Yes, that's $14.1 million versus basically the income level, which is only 1.3. So much higher extremes of wealth in comparison. I won't spend a lot of time on that. This gives us our world wealth. So this gives a sense of just how low the wealth is. So in all these countries, average wealth is below 5,000, in some cases, only hundreds of dollars each. And that just means they have nothing to fall on. This is the worst region in the world in terms of the lowest levels of wealth, relative to all other parts. We have then the growing concentration of wealth. This gives us the 1995 to 2001 period. Incredibly disturbing, because we look at the top 1% captured. Yes, that's correct. From 1995 to 2021, 38% of the global wealth. It's been an extreme case of the enormous concentration of wealth over this period from 1995 to 2021, and a bit earlier than that. The bottom only got 2% of the global wealth growth. This is what's going on in the world. Huge dynamics of concentration of wealth over time. And you can see the rising levels of the share of wealth of both global billionaires. The top 1%, I want to get through this fairly quickly. Bottom 5% flat in terms of 1995, 2001. And yes, that's true. Today, the top 0.001% does get more than 6% of the entire global wealth. Enormous concentration, all heading in the wrong direction. And then you have the extreme concentration of capital, wealth inequality across the country. Again, looking at the top 10%, Sub-Saharan Africa is bad as anywhere in the world, in terms of the underlying concentrations. Again, it's just the relative figures of this, very tiny figures, the lowest for the bottom 50%, as we saw. And this tells us basically global millionaires and billionaires. Yes, that is true. Nine people have on average 1.3, have a total of 1,320. That is, yes, $1.320 trillion, right, among 90 people. And you go all the way up there, huge concentrations of wealth. You don't see the uber wealthy. They live in their own world. I've never met any, not that I ever wanted to. I have to get invited to Davos, and they haven't yet invited me there. But so the uber wealthy people hang around each other, but it's so extreme. In some cases, it simply isn't enough. So they put pressure, putting money into the coffers, hundreds of millions of dollars, into people trying to push an agenda, which is even more problematic in places like the United States, where there's unfettered laws for election support. And what we have here, I think, which should be noted, is a big worsening of global wealth in the period of COVID. That's the last thing I want to do with data. What about the trends in Africa? Gini coefficients all heading in the wrong direction. These are really bad Gini coefficients because they're based on consumption. It's a lot worse in reality because it leaves out savings and leaves out leaves out big ticket items that people invest in. So even if this is occurring, this is problematic. This just shows you that on average, with the data I could put together, on average is rising across the board, across a large number of students and a number of places in the wrong direction. This gives us our Gini global wealth in African countries. Yes, that is a Gini coefficient in some places of 81.3, guys. I mean, it's unbelievable. The wealth concentrations in some of these places with an average of 75.3. And this is, of course, the consumption side. So things in reality are even worse than that. Depressing. We have our own data. We've been working on a project for 15 years with my colleagues, Kelly Askew, Riordcard, and Fusta Maganga, gathering data at the village level, doing household surveys. We do imputed income as a whole other lecture I think I've given on how we calculate it. We develop our own Gini coefficients. I trust our data better than most of the others because I actually see how it's collected. It's a methodology we developed. And even there, we see extremely high levels of inequality, Gini coefficients of generally 0.6, 0.6 all the way through 0.7, depending on the district. Extreme levels of high inequality, very high inequality of land as well. You can see across the board, again, illustrating the trends in inequality. And we did something which is really interesting. We actually returned to the same households 6-7 years later. And what we see is the inequality has not disappeared, and some places went down slightly went up. But we actually then are able to do point by point longitudinal analysis. And it tells us that things are not really getting much better. We're able to do it also for poverty analysis. Okay, so very surprising levels of income. We try to understand. So what the lecture, what the drivers are in poverty and income inequality, marketing systems, land ownership, access to subsidies, vouchers, availability of inputs, public goods, formalization, things we all should be looking at that economists for the most part no longer look at systematically. They're interested in titling. But, and we'll come back to that a bit. So you need to analyze these factors which are driving inequality over time. You can do it with some statistical work. But part of the issue is that still, and they're just celebrating one of his anniversaries, the biggest thinker of the dynamics of inequality in developing countries comes from Simon Kuznets, right? And what's the argument? Well, regions like Africa with low industrialization and very high reliance on agriculture, they should have equitable distribution. Because, land's pretty equitable in the rural areas, income is pretty, there's not a huge extremes availability among peasants, and but unfortunately, the reality is different than prediction. And the real problem is that Kuznets, like typical neoclassical economists, are arguing on basic neoclassical terms. What they're arguing, in essence, is that factors of production in a competitive market are supposed to be paid according to their marginal contribution of production. And that's complete nonsense. We'll explain why that is the case, but it's still the dominant domain. So Kuznets is saying, oh, look, Africa, it's mostly rural, it's mostly equal levels of land access, hence it should have an equal distribution of income. It's only later when you industrialize that income distribution becomes worse and then improves later on. And, and I could spend a lot of time, I talk about it in the paper, I published a bit on it, about how the neoclassicals, instead of saying this is wrong, try to come up with invention as to why it's slightly off. Here are the factors that are in fact affecting this, and why it isn't actually true. This is typical of neoclassicals. They don't reject their hypothesis. They're very axiomatic. It's always trying to explain something that can come up with a factor, although automatically this factor will eventually hold. And so the idea here, of course, is peasants receiving income commensurate with their land and labor. And I've already explained this. So the idea, of course, behind it, which drives neoclassical economics, is free competition tends to give labor what labor creates, capitalists what capital creates, and entrepreneurs what coordinating function creates. So the share of income accruing to resource owners is given by the exchange value lost if the resource was held back from the production process. So here, the invisible hand of the market is supposed to ensure that people receive the income that is entirely commensurate with their value of the contribution to production, right? And why is that? Because, the market basically is saying if you leave, you have to be replaced, and hence this will be what the entrepreneurs, in fact, are going to pay. And basically, this is simply an assertion. There's no empirical basis for it. It gets taught over and over in micro classes to this date. This is the same crap that's taught in every introductory microeconomics class. the distribution of income. And basically, it's nonsensical because factors of production are integrated and they're contingent and interactive. And there really is no good measurement of the value of the marginal product of a factor. And so what it is, in essence, is a normative argument dressed up as objective. And what it does is it plays a very important ideological role because it says markets know best. You're getting what you deserve. It's consistent with what you contribute to production. And hence, what else you can do? So improve your human capital, find other ways to increase the value of your production and your input. You'll get paid more. It's complete and utter ideological fiction. And so there's also, I was taught from my undergraduate days, University of Toronto, I was taught also there's a trade-off between efficiency and equity, right? And it was drummed into us. It was all the introductory textbooks, maybe discussed a little less today. It comes from the work of Okun, who summed it up nicely. Any insistence on carving out the pie into equal slices would shrink the size of the pie. This fact basically poses the idea there's a trade-off between economic efficiency and equity. And so in essence, as Okun argued in the original article, inefficiencies arise because redistribution is kind of like a leaky bucket. You get losses because of administrative costs. It creates distortions in the market and misdirects your work effort, and there's less motivation to undertake efficiency-enhancing activity. And so, in some senses, then, and it's not something that's disappeared. So Robert Lucas, the great Nobel Prize winner, partly for his nonsensical theory of real business cycle analysis. That's a lot of discussion. So what does Robert Lucas argue? He says, of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, in my opinion, and the most poisonous is to focus on the question of distribution. Well, not all mainstream economists believe that. I would say Lucas probably still largely believes that, in his Chicago focus. But the basic position is, how do you mess with the market when it's so perfect? It's telling you exactly your worth is determined by the market. How can you question that? It's subjective. It doesn't make bad decisions, and hence, in some senses, it tells you what your worth is in the production process. How dare you question it? And so, in essence, it's the idea that the market knows how best to reward people's talents, their sacrifices, and the risks they're willing to take. The market simply dictates this. This is what's drummed into every student. Every year, I don't teach in the economics department at the University of Michigan. I teach economics and African studies. I teach some economics and epidemiology, right? I teach it to international students. And I always ask them, I said, am I misrepresenting what they're being taught over there? Not once have they said, Professor Stein, that's not true. Every time they reaffirmed it's the same stuff that is taught over to this moment. And I would argue probably the same stuff that is taught here in economics departments. And basically, the idea is that you've got to provide proper rewards. If you have these distortions, it was a hard of structural adjustment, it's going to create a real problem for propensity for people to shirk and to free ride, and hence don't mess with the market. It's telling us what to do. The market knows what's best. In some senses, then, the real problem is, I would argue, inequality is really a disease. It cripples those who are economically and socially disadvantaged from really participating more fully in life processes. And some mainstream economists, Jeffrey Sachs, people always say, what do you think of Jeffrey Sachs? I say, what's Jeffrey Sachs? Mr. Shock Therapy of 1990s? Or are we talking about Save the World? Jeffrey Sachs, who wants to become president of the World Bank and goes around to all the capitals to try to get put in place? Are we talking about the Jeffrey Sachs who gets involved with money and development goals? Oh, the Jeffrey Sachs now who says he doesn't like inequality. All right, so what does Jeffrey Sachs say? It's hard to see how a society sharply divided between rich and poor can come close to even rudimentary efficiency, much less the high standard of raising every child to its potential. Unequal societies tend to be places of low social trust, unstable politics, and corruption. The rich may shield their incomes from the poor by manipulating politics. The great addiction, of money in politics in the United States for financing these campaigns cost of social unrest, higher cost of doing business. Society suffers both from lower national income because of crime, instability and corruption, the overall detriment of psychological well-being between the rich and the poor, rising census, social detentions, deterioration also in governance, overall decline of social trust and mutual support. Hard to argue against that, right? But then how do we solve this problem in the world of Jeffrey Sachs? Okay, you ready for this? Get an education. The most important component, he argues, of human capital and the most important source of economic inequality is the inequality of human capital, especially education, job market skills. That's the real problem. We're back to a neoclassical world, right? Go get educated, you'll get paid all right. You know, this is how we solve the problem. But the problem is that in some senses, it's just a little bit more complicated than this. This guy Stein says in this article, inequality is not a product of individual choices, but a result of social dynamics that divide people into gender, race, nationality, religion, and class, which form the core of the divisive separation between those enjoying privilege and those undergoing deprivation. Today, the situation is much worse than it's ever been in a lot of ways, in a lot of countries, particularly in Africa. The idea of a trade-off between equity and efficiency is simply perverse. It justifies the vested interests and the status quo. It's not positive for development for a whole plethora of reasons. You might say, okay, so who cares? Well, I want to look at one issue, and we can talk about many issues. I'm an epidemiology professor, so I'll talk about health and the relationship between inequality of income and inequality of health. And we don't talk about this enough. And of course, what's incredibly important is how the health is distributed. You know, in the United States, we feel it a lot more than in this country, where you have much more equitable distribution of health. So in the literature, and I teach this in my graduate course, I talk about the linkages between inequality and health. And one, of course, is two very common divides in the literature. One is the psychosocial interpretation, and the other is the neo-material interpretation. And psychosocial focuses on psychoneuroendocrine, basically responses, stress-induced behaviors, smoking, less civic participation, the notion that you're worthless and it has a big psychological impact on you, and responses to the stress of inequality are then really central to interpretation. How are people psychologically feeling about being lesser, being much less, not earning as much, constantly struggling? And in some senses, the perception of your place in the social hierarchy then translates directly into your internal thought processes with terrible implications. And we know it's quite well documented, the relationship between stress and self-perception and worth and people's health. But basically, the key then is just simply perceptions and how people react to those perceptions, psychological. Others say that's not enough. We have to talk about material conditions and the relationship between material disparity and health outcomes. And so one of the things you look at is the differential exposures and experiences due to lack of material resources. Of course, what we know is the whole idea of environmental justice movement. Some of my colleagues are involved in this very early on, which has become important in understanding environmental justice, the huge disparities income-wise to your exposure to toxins in the environment that you're in. The huge systemic underinvestment in human infrastructure explicitly accounts for larger economic and political processes, which then drive the elements of inequality. And so in essence, all of these contribute in terms of accessibility to systems to health inequalities. And hence, health inequalities can be reduced through altering material conditions. Some argue you've got to go a bit beyond that. And part of it is kind of what we call theoretically the critical realism, some of the kind of a political economy or Marxian tradition, in which the idea that, that your mind-dependent aspects of the world that reaches to understand the mind-independent aspects. You have to understand independently the dynamics of the way society and the fabric of society is created, often hidden, which then creates and reproduces these underlying stresses and inequalities basically in the system. And so it's not easily and readily observed through cause and effect. Part of the real problem has kind of been this kind of positive focus saying we can measure everything with dependent and independent variables. In essence, what we're saying is you've got to argue and say we've got to understand the underlying processes that are generating this. And too much of the positive focuses on simply looking at the cause of inequality instead of the underlying theoretical notion of what drives inequality. And so the idea is that you have to integrate inequality into the broader focal points of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, the way we divide society and the way you're positioned in society. And so it's kind of a call for international political economy approach, away from the individual, often individual analysis of the underlying material risk factors, instead of understanding what are the underlying systemic processes and real forces that are driving it. Ontologically positioned outside the empirical frame of studies, simply using national data sets. So much of our work is focusing on these national data sets, often very problematically generated. Part of it is the issue of the global burden of disease. And here we have huge and differentiated impact between the North and the South. There is really no easy model carried over from the developed world. We're in a situation in which we need to understand conceptually something called allostatic load. It's really the wear and tear in a body, which is entirely determined by where you are in society, where the inequalities are embedded. And it had huge impacts. So, we talk about retirement age, maybe people like myself, we don't have to retire so early. We've had this kind of intellectual capital, we've had our precious in the world. Then you see this poor guy or woman sitting on the assembly line their entire lives, reproducing motions the whole time or cutting meat. And the allostatic load is huge. Where the position society has huge implications to the life expectancy and their underlying morbidity. And it invokes, the work of Paul Farmer and structural violence. Some of you perhaps know. I got to meet Paul Farmer once. Unfortunately, he's passed away last year. Brilliant guy, very critical of the world he lived in. His former professor was a friend of mine at the University of Michigan. I shook his hand. I chatted for a few minutes. I didn't wash my hand for months. No, I'm joking. But it was really a great honor. This is a guy that dedicated his life and practice to dealing and understanding health in its relationship to socioeconomic status, and spend his time trying to generate income from people, both in places like Rwanda as well as in Haiti. And his idea, of course, was that structural violence, forces of tension, the forms of suffering and injustice that are deeply embedded in the ordinary nature of one's existence and where you are in that society. And the same structures that render life predictable, secure, comfortable, and pleasant for some also leads to massive amounts of poverty, insecurity, ill health, and violence. These structures basically are not natural and they're not neutral. They come out of a long history of political, economic, and social struggles and how they're manifest over time. One of the greatest contributors, of course, to this is the arrival of neoliberalism. We'll talk a bit later, and how it changed the nature of inequality and with it the implications to underlying health. Structures can and should be changed. One of the works of Coburn, for example, is to forces that generate income also generate health inequalities and exacerbate the impact of health and inequality. It's important to understand the relationship between health and inequality, the systems you're in as you're here, the degrees of economic neoliberalism, the role of the polar capital, whether you have a welfare regime or one that's driven by markets in the United States, the impact that has on inequality and social cohesion and well-being and health and economic wealth, and how all of it kind of intersects. What is, I think, one really interesting thing, and it's an older article I love showing in my classes, comes up with this thing of the index of decommodification, something the way we should think about things. It refers to the degree that citizens can get an adequate standard of living independent of the position in the market. And, high correlation in his analysis between the index and key indicators like we often use as health indicators, infant mortality, age-specific mortality, life expectancy, etc. Very simply, it shows neoliberal regimes of similar income levels have huge and differential outcomes in health inequality. And so understanding how the system is built is extremely important. So to understand inequality, to really understand its dynamics, we've got to get beyond neoclassical economics. And we have to focus on the evolution of institutions, the underlying nature of economic structures and how they've changed over time, the way in which Africa is integrated in the global economy, which in turn actually then generates patterns, historical patterns, contemporary patterns of income inequality. The same generation of inequality also generates the social dislocation that's associated with social inequality. It's extremely important understanding these underlying linkages, particularly as a development economist. So what are the institutional explanations of rising inequality in Africa? And it's obviously, there's many things that could go on for hours. Let me give you some examples of what the drivers were historically in Africa. One thing is, of course, the impact of neoliberalism manifests as structural adjustment in the 1980s. And, I've been in Africa long enough to see in person what has transformed over time, on a daily basis. And the basic thing is the absolute central notion of power and the nature of the structures which create the dynamics of disparities in wealth and inequality. And so an institutional theory of distribution points to the need to understand power's relationship to the contestation of interests, which are at the very heart of how income is generated and allocated in terms of the shares of material rewards. Really, the key to understanding this is, over time, the comparative power of peasants and workers, the nature of how policy choices change the nature of the rules and regulations, the conditions in which workers occur, and they've influenced the institutions and structures that have generated domestic and global production. An incredibly important part of that is how Africa is situated in the global financial and trade structures. We'll talk about that. So following independence, just to go through a bit of history, what you had is governments Africanizing their civil services. They often left in skewed scales of pay. Those who are well-connected could get very good jobs, earning well above the median income. Marketing boards were kept in place because it was the main mechanism which the state could earn income. But in the process, of course, it exploited peasants. They kept a certain percentage of the export value. Comparatively little invested in agriculture, though often things like fertilizer were subsidized in a number of countries. In some places, like in Tanzania, one of the greatest subsidies to producers was pan-territorial pricing. So if you lived thousands, 1,500 kilometers away where you had to send your goods, you got the same price. It was a massive subsidy and actually created a lot of bread baskets in remote parts of Tanzania, which helped food production over time. But of course, the neoclassicals don't like that. It gave also access to credit and subsidized rates. Income was taxed, taxing cash crops as a mechanism to support import substituting industrialization. There was a careful control of what the workers could get. In Tanzania, for example, the minister of labor was the head of the union. A little bit of conflict of interest, right? In often parastatal or state organizations. But the income we really have during that period is pretty scarce. We don't really have good data. We can only guess that probably things were better than the colonial period. But what we do have is that we have the income. We can carefully document to some extent the transformation with the arrival of neoliberalism. And it was huge because you've got to remember that what really generates your capacity to get income are the rules and regulations in your bargaining power, the extent of unionization, your ability to battle in comparative power over the share of value added, which you're going to get. And this is what transformed not only for workers, but also for farmers. And so spending on agriculture was massively curtailed. This is all carefully documented. They got rid of fertilizer subsidies, which was a big support for production levels. Farmer incomes plummeted. And where there used to be price support for farmers, it disappeared. And then you were basically subject to the whim of middlemen buying your products. And to this day, the number one complaint as we've gone through 50 villages in Tanzania is the goddamn middlemen, because they're exploited, as we go through. You have poor roads, declining access to credit, lack of transportation, paucity of storage facilities, and enormously weakened the power of farmers to earn income. They were forced often because there was huge pressures from user fees to come up with money to send their kids to school or to go to healthcare facilities, and they were desperate for cash. So they would sell at the worst time, which is, of course, harvest time. And because they didn't have the storage facilities, because the storage facilities the government used to put in place disappeared with this period. And that threw them to the whim of middlemen and middlewomen. Basically, what ended up happening is they ended up selling their crops for a fraction of the price. We've documented some of this. So in the 40 villages, for example, and the first part of our 12-year study in 4 regions of Tanzania, sometimes they were getting 50% of the wholesale price, half of what they deserved at the wholesale level, because they're being screwed by middlemen. And the middlemen were collusive, and they wouldn't have, in some cases, you have people in the village operating for the middlemen, and they were desperate. And so in some senses, you say, what can you do about this? Well, somebody says, well, get a telephone, and you can find out what the real price is. It doesn't help you if you can't take your goods to a marketplace to sell. In some cases, in very remote places, very expensive, and you can't wait till the price is higher because there are no storage facilities and you're desperate for cash. And so it led to a situation where even then sometimes very problematic low prices were even worse because you're getting such a small share of the production. It deliberately came out of the transformation of the nature of the policy approach. The same thing happened of adjustment for workers. There was massive cut in state parastatal wages and employment. It was the idea that Africa was bloated. So let's cut back the state, leading to a massive cutback in formal sector employment levels and huge cut down. Let's privatize, and a huge cut down on the state enterprises, and it had a huge impact on the market power of workers. It busted the unions. Unionization dropped dramatically, in some cases, and had huge implications for inequality. And in Kenya, for example, wages basically after a decade of adjustment of the total expenditures of the Kenyan government fell to half, 31 to 15.6%. Massive decline in the amount of income you're giving to workers, easily documented. Huge decline in social services expenditure. Government said, the conditionality came in, you're spending too much on education, you're spending too much on healthcare, et cetera, privatize it, put in user fees, cut back on your spending. And it led to a situation where what got reallocated, well, the debt went up and they had to service it. And so austerity combined with liberalization, changing the nature of the rules, led to a huge contraction in economic activity. Africa went through a Great Depression. By some measures, the 80s and 90s saw a 40% decline in per capita income. That's a Great Depression in Africa. It's huge. And in the case, for example, of Tanzania, Peter Gibbon did a good study at one point about 183 state investments. Only 83 were privatizations. The rest were closed down. Massive number of people in the formal sector lost their jobs. And so this had a huge decline in the level of formal sector employment. Van der Hoeven does a fantastic job in 2000 looking at the impact on income inequality in labor markets arising from structural adjustment. And basically what happened in short run policy change adjustment were generally aimed at improving allocated efficiency through cost cutting, removal of impediments like minimum wages, and huge cuts in formal sector employment. And so at the same time, adjustment dealt with balance of payments crisis, led to declines in currencies, rise in basic goods, tightening of monetary policy, cuts in employment, further falling impact on income levels, declining even further formal sector employment. And so basically the decline in formal sector employment relative to the total labor force in African countries study led to a drop on average of 25% in the ratio in Uganda between 1995 and 1995. Given the adjustment focus on government austerity, massive declines in public sector employment. In 4 countries over the same period, it fell by an average of 30% to level only 6.26% of the total labor force. Massive cutbacks in what were the biggest sources often of employment, the formal sector. And so huge declines across the board, dramatically increasing and weakening labor and unemployment, pushing people into the informal sector, what often became survival activities. Wage shares declined dramatically, workers desperate for jobs, basically across the board. In some cases, ridiculously low levels, where the wage share in Ghana, 1985 and 92, was only 13.8% of the value added, incredibly small compared to the 1970s. So we see these patterns over time of declining wages, declines in trade unions, dramatically changing the power of labor to access income. Inequality was further exacerbated by the transformation of the nature of social spending with a huge divide in healthcare. A survey of 12 countries through the 1980s saw an average decline of close to 20% in health spending per capita in some senses. And then the introduction of user fees, which became ridiculously impossible for local people. This misconception in neoclassical economics that you somehow have a difference between what you're willing to pay and what you can pay is such nonsense. Because often the idea, well, if we just privatize everything, we don't have to worry about it. It's the work of De Ferrante. Put in a user fee because, it's your opportunity costs of waiting. This is going to free up and give income to these local health clinics. It didn't happen that way. The choice simply of opportunity costs was not the notion of waiting, like some rich economist that says, you got to pay me a higher wage at university because I can get a higher wage in the private sector. So pay me, that's my opportunity cost. No, the real opportunity cost was, do I get to the health clinic or do I eat? That was the real opportunity cost. And that was forgotten in these survival activities. In some cases, can you imagine this? At the time that AIDS was hitting the continent, they introduced user fees in sexually transmitted disease clinics. That was simply a death sentence for people, opening up to the comorbidities, which dramatically increased HIV. In one case, we have a good study from 1991 in Kenya of a huge decline in people going to STD clinics. Was that because they all of a sudden didn't have STDs? No, it's because user fees were introduced. There was a huge literature, and the World Bank completely ignored it for over a decade. It was all careful empirical work by some of my colleagues in epidemiology and otherwise, showing what impact it was having on the underlying health conditions of people in Africa. Ignored. What changed the World Bank's notion of user fees in healthcare and education? The Democratic Party in the 2000 appropriations bill sent a little notice to the executive director in the World Bank for the United States saying, user fees for these poor kids in public schools, maybe not such a good idea. Will you please stop approving a loan based on this conditionality in healthcare and education? That's why it changed. Joe Stiglitz once told me the story. He said, the executive director kind of forgot to tell that and approve some of the loans with more of this conditionality. He got in trouble because somebody inside the World Bank heard about this and ratted on him. And then he had to remove that. So it was only the thing that changed the nature of a user fee was not the overwhelming negative impact on people's health or people's education access. It was because the United States said, okay, now you can get rid of user fees. But it went on for a decade and a half in these countries with huge implications to people's health and welfare on inequality. Because when you privatize things and put in user fees, it means that more of your very limited income is going for social expenditures and is less for something else. A huge exacerbation of income inequality and a contribution in the miserization of the population in Africa. It was a huge, huge tragedy. Life expectancy fell in Africa during this period, from roughly 50 to 46 years between 1980 and 2003. It was not simply the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It was in countries outside of South Africa where the HIV/AIDS was the highest because of huge declines of life expectancy, because of all of the impact of neoliberal health policies and other impacts of inequality in the economy. One of the other issues, of course, was education. Higher education was an incredibly important project in Africa after independence. Universities were incredibly important to raise the standard of living. This is how they knew they could create, and educate the population. Education was so badly neglected during the colonial period. Sadly, Portugal being one of the worst, in terms of actually spending on higher education. So at independence, they needed doctors, they needed teachers, they needed lawyers, they needed civil servants, they needed engineers, they needed all of these things. A heavy emphasis was on education, and these were expanding. But the crisis in the 70s pushed these African governments into the hands of the World Bank, the IMF, and the donors at a time when neoliberalism was becoming the mode of thinking in education. You read the documents of the 70s and 80s I have of the World Bank, I pull my hair out. Fortunately, I still have a little, so I did pull a little out. But what you had is you had these documents saying Africa doesn't need higher education because their comparative advantage only needs primary education. Let's stop subsidizing higher education. Let's have cutbacks in that. They're spending too much money on it. It's only going to the wealthy. And it was extraordinary. And it was right in line with Africa's comparative advantage. You don't really need higher education. When was this happening? When Africa was at the point in which the global economy was transforming from one being heavily resource intensive to one being heavily information and technology intensive. which takes education. And that's when this massive cutbacks on education, and it really was, World Bank and others really need to answer for what they did, because they put the conditionality to massive cutbacks in higher education. It's well documented. These documents are out there. You can read them. It's unbelievable to say, oh, Africa doesn't really need higher education. And then they said, okay, do primary education. Then they introduced user fees in primary education. It led to a generation or more of kids not even getting a primary education because they couldn't afford to go to the primary schools. I'm not making this up, guys. This is all documented empirically. It's a story which is aptly centrally to be told. And you can tell because when they started getting rid of user fees in places like Burundi and elsewhere, all of a sudden you had 80, 120% increases in primary education levels in 1 year. It's documented because of the user fees. And the idea, well, it was just these people just were, the reason we were going to school is because, it didn't have an impact on their ability. It was their willingness. They didn't want to send their kids to school. It's just such nonsense from these neoclassicals that occurred. So higher education, then, as we talked about too much, was put more into universities. So there was a huge reallocation away from higher education. We started charging tuition. There were massive cutbacks on the wages of huge cuts back in expenditures. Collapse of staff vacancies went up, huge collapses in the income that these earning. So huge increases in the number of students. They said, okay, you want students? Well, just open up your campuses. Campuses was made for 3,000 students, all of a sudden had 20,000 in Dakar. Basically, lecturers are only earning $19 a day in places like Makerere University. In 1992, the average real salary in Nigeria was 10% of what it was in 1978. Massive cutback on education. And so what you had then is you had a situation of a survey of 35 one African countries. They stopped getting books for students. We fall by 86%. And so at that point in time, Africa could not participate in the global economy. Why is that important? Because your standard of living and your rise of your standard of living, as we know so much in Asia, was linked to your capacity to participate in the global knowledge economy. And that's when Africa's capacity was dramatically demobilized. It was a terrible tragedy and a crime in some ways. And so it was at a point in time where African income could have gone up for the poorest with the participating, and that opportunity was lost as Africa began to fall back more on resource production. So let's come back to a couple of the other issues in closing, looking at some of the global dimensions of this. So what has happened, of course, globally is one of the reasons we have such inequality is because you have the creation in Africa of the worldwide of the value chain economy. So what we had, of course, is why do we have declines of income in the United States? The jobs moved offshore. You moved everything into supply chain. And you found some places where you could produce the same thing more cheaply. You had a massive decline in the number of unionized jobs. And so what you had is a transformation of the global economy. And so today, maybe more than 60% of all trade is a company trading to itself, right? It's no longer, the idea of comparative advantage between countries taught in introductory international trade course is nonsense. That's not how the global economy operates. Now, it is true business courses and stuff are a bit better on this issue, but it's extraordinary. I look at the international trade courses and I go, how do they teach this crap? It's so inconsistent with the world we live in. So basically, and of course it's worse than that, because they divide and subdivide, get control of technology, and then not only do they move the jobs offshore, they move the money offshore. So they don't have to pay taxes and tax havens. It's called transfer pricing, right? What you do simply is you produce something in one country, you sell it at a low price, right? And they don't make any profits. You sell it to another company in another country, which is your affiliate at a higher price, and all the money sits offshore in the profits because you're then gleaning all the profit. There's no taxation then declared. And it's gotten worse and worse. So where is Africa in this process? Africa is at the bottom of the value chain. Unprocessed raw materials, very little value added, terms dictated from outside. And that's where it's happened as the global structure of trade is transformed. Africa finds it the very worst. And so when the global recession hits, so goes often down their prices. And I'd argue, of course, that much of the commodity prices today are determined by derivatives and swaps which have absolutely nothing to do with the actual need of the commodity. It has to do with speculation that goes in and pulls out of these markets, driving prices in different directions. So Africa countries are basically subject today to the vicissitudes of prices entirely beyond their control. They're price takers. And that's incredibly problematic. So they live and die by what's going on with the commodity markets in the system. Financialization has had a profound impact, because not only are you keeping it offshore, when these companies put their money back in, what do? It's an absolutely insane system in the United States. The vast majority of the money today goes to stock buybacks. It goes to paying dividends to rich people. This is what's really created the profit has gone into the accumulation of wealth of people that are owners of these companies, the managers who earn hundreds of millions of dollars on stock options and otherwise. It's all about shareholder value with virtually no containment or regulation to deal with it, because yeah, they finally put a little tax on it. But of course, all this money going into both the Democratic and Republican Party, they're not going to be sitting here saying, hey, we should put a tax on shareholder buybacks. No, it's not going to happen. And that's what's transpired. And so what has happened is we've had this redistribution of income towards profit at the expense of wages, and a mechanism which feeds into the dynamics of the accumulation of wealth in the world. And so what's happened, of course, is transnational corporations have squeezed at the lower end. Basically, it's not some law or some natural process of how economic markets are operating. It's a deliberate process of intervention, creating systems which reproduce the power structures that keep in place the global value-added mechanisms, the way the international corporations operate virtually without a constraint. Look how hard it was just to put a 15% tax across the board on these, with a huge international organization to do it, which kind of is just the very tip of the iceberg. So the problem, of course, as we said, that neoliberalism changed and increased the reliance of African countries on raw materials. And way back when in 1992, a few of us predicted in articles it would deindustrialize Africa, and it did. And so what transpired basically is that Africa's ability to get beyond and begin to process these raw materials was entirely demobilized, basically. And moreover, here entered neoliberalism with the pressure on the changing the nature of the restrictions on capital flows. So everything moving towards demobilizing restrictions, demobilizing restrictions on ownership, demobilizing restrictions on trade, opening up Africa to the global economy with virtually no capacity to control its impact. And so, of course, we've talked about the betrest of offshore havens, which of course should be talked about as the World Trade Organization's absolutely disgraceful 1995 extension of copyright basically property rights to 20 years, protecting the developed countries and the technology, and so all of this has reinforced the enormous power of transnational corporations at the expense of the poorer countries and others in the world. So Africa has expanded its exports in 2000 without a comparable expansion. It's well documented and domestic value added. And so it's meant basically that African countries participate in the value chain at the very lowest level without any value added, without the capacity to raise incomes or internally, in some cases, profits. In some senses, then it's helped to create this dynamic of inequality in African countries as a mechanism in which they are involved in the global production system. The other thing that's important to talk about, is not talked nearly about, is a financial architecture, which feeds into inequality. And so what we have here is an incredibly important story, which is the nature of the hierarchy of currencies in the world. And so what has transpired is that African countries find themselves at the bottom of that hierarchy in a situation of complete financial subordination. What does it mean? It means that their currencies are unstable, they have no international circulation, they're in a constant pressure to accumulate dollars or their equivalents in hard currencies. It does not allow them to avoid a debt crisis, because you're constantly in a situation where you're constantly in a position where you're trying to protect yourself from the next debt crisis. You're not utilizing those dollars to transform your economies. because they'll fall apart the moment the next debt crisis comes in with the neoliberal pressure of the IMF. One of the things that African governments do is they really try to avoid going to the IMF, because they know when they go to the IMF, they're going to be stuck with pro-cyclical policies, meaning if you're in a recession, you're in a crisis, you're going to have to cut back even more. They still do this. It's still based on the Pollack model of the 1950s, which we could talk about at great length. It's still, to this moment, it's still pro-cyclical policies. And the real problem is this latest crisis, both the combination of the war and COVID, has now put into the hands of the IMF more than 40 sub-Saharan African countries. This is a disaster. If you look at the 2008 crisis, the numbers were much smaller. Less than half of that went to the IMF. Why? Because they had accumulated enough reserves, and because there was still a lot of speculative money that kept commodity prices high through 2015, and then it collapsed. And at that point, they were accumulating the reserves, this is all well documented, to try to prevent the next crisis. But even then, they didn't have enough to deal with the current downturn, which was both prices and a price shock, along with rising food prices, along with commodity declines in prices. And so, in essence, what it meant when you go to the IMF, you've got pro-cyclical policies, fiscal austerity, rising interest rates, which creates pressure on these economies. So they're able to slightly avoid it. I documented this in the paper I wrote on Africa and the Great Recession. They were actually able to, because they had reserves at that point, some expenditures, because commodity prices stayed up, they were able to actually do much better to avoid the IMF after the 2000 Great Recession than many other countries in the world. But that's all changed now. And now we have countries defaulting like Ghana. Ghana at one point, this was the darling of the world. I can read you quotes. Well, Ghana had to suspend their payments on debt. They're in a huge, deep debt crisis. At some point, close to 80% of their total government revenue was going to debt support. So they couldn't do it anymore. And again, it's because there's a systemic problem of buying into a system of financial subordination where they spend their whole lives trying to accumulate this thing generated by the United States costlessly called the US dollar, right? They can run their deficit with no problem. And Africa then has to jump through hoops all the time to try to accumulate those dollars to deal with it. And so it's been a huge issue, and it's dramatically contributed to what I call the vicious cycle of commodity dependence. By being dependent on commodities, it creates the conditions that keep you dependent on commodities, because you constantly have to put these reserves into a mechanism by which you avoid the system. And it's embedded in the financial subordination. And it's important to also understand, I once had a big argument with the head of the central bank in Nigeria. I said, why the hell is it during the Iraq war? Why the hell are you buying all these US Treasury bills supporting the invasion of Iraq? They said, well, we can't bring the money home. You know what, we'll deal with it here. Sending with billions of dollars buying US Treasury bills. It was absurd. So Africa, with its reserves, instead of bringing it back to one of the poorest nations in the world to help raise the standard of living and transform the economy, what's it doing? It's financing the war, in the United States during this period of time. And so it basically perpetuates a system that feeds into the dynamics of inequality in terms of the nature of this financial subordination. And invariably, of course, when you rely again on IMF showing up with your crisis, the people who are hit the worst always by IMF austerity are the poorest people. It exacerbates inequality. Rich people have ways to get out. People then have to pay more for food from devaluation. They lose their jobs. Government cuts back its support, et cetera, all exacerbating inequality in these countries. Okay, I've thrown enough stuff at you guys. A couple minutes of conclusions. So in 2000, the World Bank bias against higher education began to change. And they made this comment, oh, look, private returns of tertiary education in low-income countries are now frequently on par with returns from primary education. Okay, guys, you can spend some money in higher education. This is the inanity of this thing. And so then they said that could occur. Okay, human capital was seen as a main route to growth and transformation along neoclassical terms, because it would enable African economies to increase allocative efficiency, maximize return, initially limited supplies of physical capital. The problem with this approach, of course, is that it simply raising people's education doesn't solve the problem. Because as I tried to demonstrate, the problem is systemic, it's structural. It's embedded into the nature of the way the global economy and domestic economies are configured. In some senses, without the ability to generate jobs to utilize that education. It's not going to change much. There isn't much thinking along those lines in these African countries. And so the key element, of course, of raising a standard of living is moving labor from low to higher value-added activities. Institutional economists recognize that economic development requires structural transformation of the economy. Markets are not generally a very effective way to deal with it by themselves. Industry and manufacturing, we know, is well known, tends to have higher value added than the service and agricultural sectors. And so what is key is needed is an industrialization strategy. But frankly, neoclassicals really don't know how to do that in Africa. They really don't have a clue on how to do that. The institutional approach basically to distribution points to the enormous importance of understanding power and its relationship to the contestation of interests, which at the very heart of the determination of the allocation of material shares of rewards. Power in a market basically context is related to the nature of the working rules, reflecting the shifting nature of power symmetries in these economies. And so understanding the forces that select these rules, shape these institutions, the dynamics of relative power, both domestically and globally, are what are really necessary to understand what's going on of income inequality. The ability, obviously, to break out of the system is not going to happen from using anything from neoclassical economics, but it really requires a whole new set of constructs. It needs broadening people's education, and tools are out there to both understand the sources of power that help to perpetuate the system, and then to identify where that power can be contested. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got plenty of time for questions and comments.
May I ask a question?
Please introduce yourself and then.
I'm a student here from ISEG, PhD student in management.
Okay.
Okay, and I want to ask one thing, but before that, I need to say sorry for the late, for being late. Okay, so I hope that my question.
You didn't miss much. Don't worry.
Now, okay. Okay, so we are talking about inequality in Africa. But I want to ask you one thing. I'm studying about entrepreneurship, and many of my studies, I have papers from Africa, and they say that one of the biggest problems in Africa is the shadow economy. For example, in the West Africa, the shadow economy represents about 40 to 60%. What can the developed countries make or do to lower this rate and promote equality or more equality in these areas? Thank you.
Should I take a few other questions?
Rather we get like two
Yeah,
or
sure.
three questions,
Maybe one or
and
two other
then
questions,
we'll
and I'll
get-
respond.
Sure. So, if you have any points on which you like clarification, we've got plenty of time, so go ahead.
All right. I'm just responding to the first question quickly. Go ahead, please. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Vincent Aguiloye. I want to quickly ask, there is this challenge with the post Washington consensus disaster on policy planning, especially development planning in Africa, in most parts of Africa. From the Washington consensus through the post-Washington consensus, there has been this like you rightly enumerated, most of these policies end up aiming towards one direction: the privatization policy and the shift of development planning in the continent. What is your take on the contemporary status of budgeting and development planning in Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
First of all, thanks for this presentation. I'm Gianluca, I'm a third-year PhD candidate.
Okay.
Here, I was thinking about one of the last slides. So, in relation to the fact that we have a sort of lack of the structural change, structural transformation influence also the level of inequality, measure inequality that you were talking about, I was thinking, so the answer would be some sort of import substitution, because when thinking about also global value chain, pointed out the fact that they have intrinsic problems, especially in relation to the fact that maybe some African countries cannot maybe jump in the global value chain properly, and so practically also with the structural problems such as inequality. But I was thinking, like, for instance, the cause of South Korea is actually a virtuous example of how sometimes global value chain can actually help in catching up. So I was thinking, like, what do you think about that? If import substitution can be a solution, but maybe also institutions can be some sort of mediation of the potentiality of global chains. So maybe some more.
Okay, so let me start with the last question, and then I'll work backwards. So basically, I've studied and written a bit on the Asian experience. The one thing that needs to be emphasized is no country did export orientation or import substitution. They always combined them. Any success, because the idea always was, I once had a debate with the most notorious neoliberal Ann Kruger once, and she gave early 90s, she gave a presentation and she said, I said, didn't South Korea do both in a staged way? And she said, no, she yelled at me, only export orientation, because that's the only way you can industrialize. It was just nonsense. What Korea did, and we documented this paper done by Quinn Common, a paper I edited a long time ago, 1995, an edited volume. And it clearly showed it was a staged process of import substitution combined with export orientations. But what also was really central in that was understanding the financial system. And one of the things they had there is they had this thing called policy loans. So the government actually took on the risk to finance this by in fact taking international loans and taking on and then reloaning it with very careful documentation and a very careful coverage of what was going on in the companies with the the Jabals going through the stage process. So they really went carefully, starting with import substitution, putting up some high barriers, but allowing things they needed to come in freely, like such as capital goods. And so you have this whole stage where they went through heavy industrialization. It was cheap to get those, and it became costly. They gave on average something like 5 years of tariff support. Then they switched it over, and they made sure the tap was constantly on financially. Is there a single African country that did that? No. Nobody's kind of thought through the process. The other thing these countries did is they all heavily subsidized wages. Every single country in Asia heavily subsidized wage through one mechanism or the other. In Singapore, supposedly a fairly free state, they provided cheap housing through the Provident Fund. Workers didn't have to worry about housing because it was taken care of by the state. And that meant that the companies could then hypothetically pay comparatively nominal wages, which has much real wage consequences. In Taiwan, what did they do? In Taiwan, through the industrialization process, they traded rice for fertilizer. So they made rice really cheap in the early stage of industrialization. So you could there, and then they made sure that there was a contingent. They wouldn't allow this bullshit of taking your money and investing in your shares. No, the money had to be reinvested in the company in order to be able to work that process. And you look at all these cases, in China, it's a whole other different approach. Some of it's a lot of local townships that put a lot of money in and finance it. In other cases, you've got the Iron Bowl in China. What is the Iron Bowl? The Iron Bowl really is all about having one member of your family with complete subsidized income, including education, and healthcare, and food subsidies, and a whole variety of things, and daycare, and the other members in the private sector. Well, that's subsidized the private sector to quarter wages because the family is seen as an entirety in its ability of reproduction. Everybody's thinking through this process, and there's different approaches to dealing with it. But this whole idea of, well, there's import substitute export orientation, you've got to follow your comparative advantage, it's nonsense. It doesn't go anywhere. It's got to be a careful stage intervention, relying to some degree, and sometimes private sector's co-ownership. In China, what they do? They didn't throw it all open to the foreign investors. They said, if you want access through our zones to domestic consumption, you better actually use X percentage of local production in what you're producing in order to get the local market. And you have to share your technology with the companies in a co-ownership. They gave much better benefits in co-ownership in zones than they did to a foreign company. So you see this careful thinking that occurred in one country after the other, which we don't see in the way, I mean, there's neoclassical economists, to be honest, I lecture to them. They don't have a clue in these African countries because they don't have the tools. What are you talking about? You know, and that's a great problem, is this terrible loss of capacity that exists from really understanding how the real world operates. You know, in some senses, what were the experiences here? How could it reproduce? So that's what we're talking about. Now, let me take it a bit further. And it's partly the issue of finance here, you know, and part of it is, what about the market? Where do you start? Well, you know, and I've been having some talks with some people involved with the new African common market.
Yeah.
Well, here you have an opportunity to implement an industrial policy continent-wise.
Yeah.
Because in essence, what you have is you have the ability to have a ready market of the entire continent. And what you do is you say, okay, you know, maybe Ethiopia is going to produce clothing, you know, and maybe Kenya can produce capital goods. And let's put our emphasis on that. And so let's give them, let's emphasize industrial zones working on this, you know, and maybe Tanzania can deal with more food processing. I mean, it's just thinking through in a coordinated fashion and saying, and that's a real problem. And I've been screaming about this for a long time. I gave a lecture in Nairobi when the East African community was being formed. And even then, these guys in the room looked at me puzzled. I said, why aren't you using this for a mechanism to specialize in production to use the entire market in all of these economies, instead of actually doing individually saying, oh, no, our common market is just free trade. We should just allow, you know, we work commonly and we have the big market and we're just going to have a common policy approach and allow the movements of goods back and forth. It doesn't do it. And unless they conceptualize it as a strategy for industrialization. Now, I'd add one other thing on the finance issue, basically, and that is the issue of the relationship between the real production side and the finance side, and what should be happening in Africa. And I have these latest paper that came out, people interviewing these central bankers. They don't know how to do this. Not a single country in this 5-country study recently done by some post-Keynesian economists at Leeds. You know, it's great. You need to talk to these people. What's your thinking about how you should deal with finance in each individual central bank? Not a single one had said, you know, we should settle our current account by accepting other people's currencies in Africa. Because all of a sudden, then you have a mechanism by which, okay, we're going to give you our currency, we'll take your currency, we then can buy each other's goods and begin to then skip this whole accumulation of dollars. Instead, they're all chasing dollars. And they're all into this mode of global finance. And in the process, it just feeds into the hierarchy of currencies and into the enormous hegemony of the US dollar. You know, and so thinking about the production side and the finance side are absolutely central as you begin to go forward, you know, in this process. Now, the issue of the shadow economy, it's a huge problem in Africa. Why is it created the shadow economy? It's not simply because the taxation system is too high or there's too many regulations. I mean, more and more the doing business stuff in the World Bank has been condemned. It's just nonsense. It doesn't do anything. It was just a recent study that came out. It was a Journal of Comparative Economics, in which they showed countries are no better off and they're worse off economically by accepting the doing business criteria. People higher in the standards have done worse economically. We demonstrate these are neoclassicals showing it. So you know, so the question becomes, it's not creating a shadow economy. The shadow economy exists because so much of it is informal. Because in some senses it's very hard to get finance. Yeah. It's very hard to operate. The conditions are not there. How do you move people out of the shadow economy? You provide them with facilities, you provide them with infrastructure, you provide them with capacity, you provide them with access to the banking system. These are the things that will move people out of the shadow economy into the real economy, because a lot of the shadow economy, by the way, is speculation. There's a lot of like buying of currency that exists, you know, which does nothing for these economies. And it's terrible because you have these capital account liberalization, and you know the biggest problem there is a few banks handling the foreign exchange, playing games with the foreign exchange, a few players dominating it. And see, it's been documented. So all these central banks are doing, they're playing catch up and defensive and trying to clean up the mess. And so whenever they get a bit of currency, they intervene in these markets to some extent because they don't want what would be a continual feedback effect of a downward move in the currency, which will be incredibly inflationary and problematic. And that's a real problem. They can't control their economies because of the nature of the system. So I think you deal with a shadow economy by providing the incentives to restrict speculation and the penalties, and on top of that, the incentives to actually get involved in places where people can earn a profit and where people can actually then get access to finance and regulation, labor, training labor. It's a thinking process that can then change the nature of production, how it occurs in these economies. Other questions? Please introduce yourself, please.
Okay. My name is Vikeya, and I'm PhD candidate here. And my question.
In which field? In development or in?
No, in economic sociology.
Economic sociology. Okay.
Yes. And my question is about currency. And I come from Angola, when the currency is always devaluating. And when I have to pay, ISEG is a headache for me because it's always down about the euro. So what do you think? Because I think this issue of currency benefits the elite because they saving here in Europe. And do you think some common currency in Southern African community development maybe can be a advantage for solving that? What is your opinion about this?
I think common currencies can be a big headache because you're giving up your monetary policy. And that's one of the big problems. I mean, the way the euro was created was incredibly problematic because you're trying to deal with Germany and Greece with the same currency. And it's hugely problematic. And I think this a beginning approach really is, and the real problems are the huge inequalities. What level are you going to be able to use in terms of targeting? So I think the starting approach is what I've suggested: clearinghouses, trying to utilize your existing currencies in a manner which allows for a trade of the currencies that's accepted. And eventually, maybe what you can do is you can get up some kind of common currency that is some reflection of the domestic currencies, some component of that. I mean, they've talked about, there's some good ideas of SDRs, actually turning SDRs into a currency globally. And that might give an opportunity for countries to get access to maybe foreign exchange and harder currencies. But the IMF's not going to do that. It's an internal account. The US is not going to give up its dollar hegemony. It doesn't want to do that. The BRICS are now threatening to do that. BRICS are not going to help Africa, guys. Sorry. It's not going to be a currency that's going to help Africa very well. I mean, there's huge debt problems with China right now. China's not giving up on the debt, it's another whole discussion. So what I'd argue is an intermediate step, the step really before you can think about that, is actually then not creating some kind of currency. And one of the problems is if, you look at a common currency, right? The Francophone zone currency, right? CFA. Look at the problems you have. It's no different. I work with a young, who's a heterodox economist, guy by the name of Ndongo Sila, who has a PhD from Paris. And he's critical as hell because who runs it? Bunch of neoliberals. They still have the same policies. If you have a common currency and you end up having the same structure of the idea of single targeting, which is inflation targeting, which is what the world focuses on. They don't even use it for the other thing, which is called unemployment, and stimulation. And so if you have that and it's run by a bunch of monetarists, you're not going to solve any problems. You're just moving the problem elsewhere. Or you look at the African Development Bank, right? I have a real problem with the African Development Bank because they're more neoliberal than the World Bank. And I've been there, and I've tried to change things. I know I was the head of the African Development Bank. I was working with another young guy who was a former student of mine at Cambridge, who invited me over, and he was trying to change things. He left. He gave up because I used to have huge vicious arguments with the chief economist there. They're more neoliberal, more neoclassical. If it's African, it doesn't change anything if you have the same mindset. And that's always got to be considered when you're configuring these things. So being Africa isn't necessarily solve the problem if you have a northern set of tools to understand the world you're in. That's why we have to change our thinking in economics so fundamentally, which of course you guys are doing a great job here in development studies, economic sociology, and of course in political economy. I had to say that, right? Okay. No, you are. So I mean, so giving these other tools are so absolutely central to understanding it. So just simply calling it African doesn't solve the problem, unfortunately. We have to change the nature of the thinking and understanding. I mean, there has been some understanding. I was in a debate recently with a Ugandan economist. It's available if anybody's interested. And the Ugandan economist admitted to me that neoclassical economic was imposed in a colonial manner in Africa. That's great for an economist to say that, but it didn't mean she said, "Oh, we should change things." She still thought this was the importance of the main thinking. It still gives us great tools because it brings rationality to economics. So I mean, there's no attempt to kind of look outside this mindset, and that's part of the issue here. Okay. Anyway.
So if I might add to that,
Sure.
Would you think that the current South-South solution to financial issues would be able to help out? Because there has been recently the efforts by China, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. They had this pact with Nigeria where they had to exchange, when they signed a pact to trade directly with China using Naira and then the yuan. Do you think that South cooperation, as it is being called, is a solution to this?
Well, I published a paper on China and Africa a few years ago in a volume put out by Justin Lin and Arkaby Okabe. We looked at China-Africa relations as we're partly looking at export processing zones there. And the problem is, if you look at the structure of trade between China and Africa, it's no better than the other parts of the world. And that's the sad part. Africa, basically Nigeria is still exporting resources and oil and importing manufacturing goods from China. And so even if you change the currency arrangements and allow it to occur, and even now all these countries have huge debt problems with China. It doesn't solve the problem because you're then kind of stuck on this continuation of mode. What's China interested? Does China really want to bring manufacturing to Africa? I don't know. I'm very suspect of this. And so that's the real problem is African countries themselves, to some extent, have to change their mindset and look internally at the dynamics that occur. You've got 1 billion plus people.
Yeah.
That's a huge potential market, but it's not being utilized.
Yeah.
How many of the goods, people are kind of producing the same things to the world and accumulating dollars. So, but part of the problem again is if you don't change the mindset and you're thinking of the tools you're using, it's not going to change anything. And that's a real problem. And African countries have to start looking elsewhere and begin to look internally, but rethinking what's occurring. And this is why the project I'm currently involved with, trying to work with Conduzida and others to build an African heterodox economics network, exactly change the nature of the education. So the tools are changing, and there is demand from some policy people. There's a group called there's a policy group that's associated with the main African institutes, and the woman who's the head of it has been working with us, saying, "Give me some other policy, give me something else to work with in these debates to come up with." But it's not there because the training's not there. We've got to change the nature of the mindset, in the thinking process and begin to deal internally.
Yeah, but I think that there is this huge burden on Africa, most African countries, because when we talk of Africa, it's 54 countries, 55 countries, if we add Western Sahara. If we look at it from this perspective, given that most African countries, like you rightly mentioned, are heavily burdened with our debts. And at the end of the day, we have after now, gladly we have after the policy you mentioned, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right, which was just recently adopted by 54 countries at the moment, remaining just Eritrea. And if we look at the reality, I did my PhD research on indigenous manufacturing in Africa, okay, as well as on indigenous agricultural transactions within Africa. Right. And if we look at it today, Africa stands as an advantage for the entire continent. But the question stands before us: beyond after, are not other producing countries or other manufacturing countries, importing countries, going to utilize the policy more than Africans themselves, because we have right now there is this new petrochemical company in Nigeria, Dangote. He just launched a refinery that will be refining products, petroleum products in Nigeria. And at the end of the day, Nigeria may not need to export its petroleum for refining. And the same thing is, if we look at the agrarian sector, we have most cotton from Burkina Faso, for example, going to Europe and Asia for production, for further production. And meanwhile, on the contrary, in Egypt, we have companies that are already producing these products from primary to secondary points, to finishing point, and they produce these products and they sell to European companies as well as Asian companies. Right. But we still have this debt burden at the end of the day when it comes to trade balancing, the international trade balance. And you see that most countries will still remain heavily burdened and will still remain indebted to all these countries where they are borrowing from. At the end of the day, if we look at it from the point of view that with this burden on each of these countries, they still would have balance of trade issues. They still would have that inability for themselves to transact or to grow their economy. Apart from the fact that they would enjoy from the internal dynamics within the continent, they would still remain poor, or rather the inequality will still remain high, because most imports, a lot of imports will still come from the outside, because most of these companies will look for their way or find their agents within the countries to move their goods around without being taxed.
So I agree with that. And what I'd say is that Africa's debt burden actually dramatically declined after HIPC and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, MDRI. Yeah. If you look at the numbers around 2005, 2006, they were very moderate.
Yeah.
But then it all came back because they did not take that opportunity to change the nature of the structures of their economies. Yeah. The policy wasn't there, the economics wasn't there, the international donors were, they're shifting things now. The answer to Africa's agricultural problems, give everybody a private property right. It's just such nonsense. I mean, and this is what we've been studying. And so that's a real problem, is there was no change in the mindset. Part of it was the institutionalization of neoclassical economics and neoliberal thinking in the policy domain. And it's just, in 2002, I was working on a project for CETA in a 3-country study of aid ownership from CETA. And I got in trouble because I wrote really critical things. I had to make some revisions. But aside from that, we went to the Ministry of Tanzania. I was interviewing somebody in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And they had no conception of industrial policy. They were being trained by the Adam Smith Institute from Australia on how neoliberalism is the way forward, just liberalize everything. And so even if the opportunity was there, maybe you have this kind of comparatively small moment in time to change the nature of business. It wasn't changing for the reasons that I suggested, because they knew a new crisis would be around. And they accumulated the debt, and they're very conservative in their approaches. And so there's nobody challenging the system, because the system is all about getting your markets working well. Yeah. It's privatizing everything. Or if the state's going to be involved, just public-private partnerships. This is the answer. It's the latest, this is what I call the flavor of the month from the international donors. And it doesn't change the mindset, because the thinking internally is the same. And because, to be honest, as is pointed out, the elites gained from the system. Yeah. Don't ever forget that they gained from also accumulating these dollars internationally, and it's a corruption system, as the work of my friend Jim Boyce and Gumina, they show that Africa is not a debtor to the rest of the world. They're a net creditor by massive amounts because of the nature of the leakages and the over invoicing that's occurred over a long period of time. And so and you look at the issue of, okay, they got access finally to sovereign debt markets beginning in 2008. Unbelievable. After decades, they finally got access to private capital. Yeah. All right. So what happened? They entered into it. And they were, as I showed in a 2015 article with all the BC, Africa was being punished for being Africa. There's no way you could use even the fundamentals to explain the interest rates they were paying. Mm-hmm. They're totally screwed internationally because you typically had a ratio of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 to 1 in the overbidding on these sovereign debt issues. So they overpaid huge amounts in terms of the interest rate. and then they got stuck into it. And then they're in a debt crisis with this international conference, because they got into it. They thought, finally, we can get some access to foreign exchange without conditionality. And that got them in trouble. And that helped them also maintain fiscal expansion during the 2008 downturn. You look at the numbers there, and you can see they partly used some of this international borrowing to keep government expenditures up. But in the process, they're back in a debt crisis again. Because they didn't use that money to transform their economies. And that's the real problem of this vicious cycle of commodity dependence. And that's the real issue. So anyway, there are ways out, but we have to start thinking really critically and use a different set of tools to understand that transformation. Okay, other questions?
Can I go?
Yes, please do.
Jean Vadone, PhD in development studies. I am thinking about the first slides that you have shown us. You have presented a very worrying picture of inequality in Africa. But yet, when we look at evidence that is presented by several organizations, including the World Inequality Lab with Piketty's researchers, there seems to be a tendency to dismiss the significance of inequality in Africa and to place the Middle East and Latin America at the world inequality frontier. Would you agree with this statement? And if you agree, what reasons do you see for this?
I think you should answer to this one.
Okay,
first. Yeah.
okay, let me respond to that. So basically, part of it, I think, is the notion that somehow Africa is in early stages and somehow things can change, maybe positively. I don't think they're right. I think it's deeply disturbing. I don't think they're very good in understanding what's going on in Africa. I don't think there's a lot of studies by the organization in Africa. I think it tends to be a bit of an afterthought. I don't think they have a lot of good effort. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's not a lot of really good, well-educated, well-situated empirical people doing work on Africa, basically. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. But my sense is that the Middle East is easy to look at because of the structures of production, because of the huge concentrations of wealth in these oil states. And it's easy to talk about how that gets reproduced because of the utilization of cheap labor that's imported, heavily exploited in these countries. Africa is a really complicated place. Ours is one of the few places, our study in rural Tanzania is really one of the few independent studies of poverty and inequality. And it's deeply disturbing. What are we finding that nobody even knows? Landlessness of 12% in Tanzania in our studies. 12% landlessness. Landlessness of 35% in the youth that are not getting access to land. There's no future for these people in rural Africa. Gini coefficients in some cases of land of nearly 0.7 or higher in some of these villages of ownership of land. Tell me if these guys are studying this stuff. They're not, because we are one of the few groups that actually gathers the empirical data that can talk about the deepening, disturbing nature of what's transforming there. And we do poverty measures, and although I'd like to have the money to study it, I see wasting, I see stunting, I see the manifestation of malnourishment in these villages, which is incredibly disturbing at this point in time. I see the existence of rampant diseases still in these places. I see the vast majority still not having access to electrification, in these places. Very problematic health clinics, very small percentages of insurance availability. And so people don't go to the health clinics, diseases. I was just in villages in Western Tanzania, and I was in 6 villages, and visiting village governments and visiting the villages. And not a single one would admit that COVID existed. Why is that? Because Magufuli said it didn't
Magufuli,
exist.
yeah.
This is madness,
Yeah.
you know? And so what we have is you have a situation of, you need to get out in to see what's actually going on the ground. There you're getting increasingly people are, there's an increasing, proletariat in there. These are working people. They no longer can survive off of their own production. They have to work on the land of the rich with concentrations. I mean, and you got people of 500,000. You sit there and you say, how the hell did that person get 1,000 hectares? And so you're seeing huge inequality of land access, which is going on. And all of these are deeply disturbing because then you're getting the movement forced from rural areas into urban areas. Well, the urban areas are informal economies. These are informal places without proper infrastructure. This is not the Lewis model of transformation. This is not industrialization, through surplus labor. There's lots of surplus labor, but there are no jobs because nobody's thinking about how you generate jobs for these people. So you're then getting rapid urbanization in these places without a transformation. And then you've got the duality in what we call the double jeopardy, health-wise. So now people are moving to urban areas and they're hit by chronic and infectious diseases, with implications to their health. And see, all of these are, inequality is deeply disturbing in Africa. What we find, as I was mentioning to Yokan the other day, in northern Uganda, people can't afford healthcare, so they sell their land. This then leads to concentration of wealth and income, which is deeply disturbing because then they've lost their ability to produce their income. So what I'd argue with those guys is you need to get on the ground to see what's going on. Yeah. I was in Uganda a few weeks ago, and I was talking to the head of development studies, and I presented our work on inequality and poverty, and she says, we want to do this in Uganda because we have no idea what's going on with inequality. We have no idea what the real poverty levels. The World Bank comes in with their consumption measurements and says, oh, things are doing okay. No, they're not, because it's deeply flawed in their measurements of poverty, And so it's how many countries have independent, non-World Bank type studies on understanding what's going on at the household level in Africa? Not many. Not using a methodology that actually says who's generating income, what's going with inequality, how much landlessness is there, what are the concentrations of wealth? I mean, none of this is really going on. This is the kind of research that needs to be on the ground to really understand what's happening with inequalities and what the pathologies of the inequalities are. Okay, so I'd argue, I'm happy to have a conversation with these guys. I don't really know them, but they, I would be very heavily questioning that argument.
I think you gave an interesting talk about a lot of stuff. And what was interesting to me that you fell back into one of the old solutions into, let's say, growth and development, if you want. That is, you have to industrialize. In this is a very old idea, isn't it? And it has not changed a lot, even in a critical approach. But meantime, a lot of work has been done about environment. So put in environment into you didn't mention it once in your approach, because probably it's very easy to build a bridge into environment from your critical approach. So do it.
Okay. So yes, I mean, it's a whole other talk. What do we mean by industrialization?
Yeah.
What's it mean today? And what's absolutely central, of course, is the greening of energy. And Africa has a huge potential along those lines. And this information technology, our whole nature of industrialization has changed, and increasing mechanization. And the environment has to be incredibly a part of that. Absolutely, something has to be sustainable in those contexts. But the issue really is we have the technological capacity to avoid the massive amounts of environmental destruction. today that we didn't have before. And I give you an example. I was a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, I was in Ethiopia. And the head of industrial zones, who's also an economic advisor to the prime minister, put me on a tour. He was a friend. I was there for a couple of workshops. He published the volumes. He put me on a tour of export processing zones. So I went to Hawassa. And Hawassa, which is an absolutely fascinating place. I mean, it's enormously fascinating. There's a company that takes a spool of mixed textile with cotton, and in the end produces $120 shirts in this entire production. It's amazing in Africa to see this, right? But of course, the potential here with dyes and everything else for pollution is huge. But they put in effect an extraordinary facility to process the water. And I went and I visited this thing, and it just blew me away. So all the pollutants and effluents went into this reprocessing plant, which used 4 different mechanisms. It was Indian produced to produce water, which is of higher quality than the original water before it came in, and it was totally reusable without putting any pollution into the system. The technology, we wouldn't have had that 25 years ago, but it's there now. So and one could say, well, it's costly, but it's probably worth it. I mean, part of the bigger issue in all of this is something which has to be addressed, and that is basically the Paris Accord. Because here you had promises of $100 billion every year going to Africa. It's not happening. And it's a demand that has to be done. That's exactly the kind of money that can be used to thinking through the environmental dimensions of an industrialization and manufacturing. It can be done. And I actually 100% agree with you. And right now, we don't have any of that in place. They're not really thinking it. And as you begin to go through, an important starting point, of course, is processing your raw materials, processing, basic things into foodstuffs to consume. I mean, these are just basic things, and it can be done, in a manner which I think has great environmental sensitivity. If you look at, you think about the technology today of telephones. Well, you no longer have to put a post with a telephone for people to get access. Use cell phones. The same thing's happening with electricity. We now have microgrids. We have the potential here with solar. You have wind. Kenya produces 40% of its energy is from geothermal, the second highest, I think, in the world, using the Rift Valley, plate and creation. So all of this creates, I think, it creates an opportunity to think about industrialization in a much more environmentally sensitive. Okay, please introduce yourself.
Sure, my name is Carl. I'm a PhD student in development studies.
Okay.
And I wanted to go back to the idea of commodity dependence, especially what you mentioned of the segmentation of global value chains, and especially kind of the situation we're seeing now with the consolidation of transnational trading companies and the marginalization of commodity producers, especially in agriculture. And I was wondering how you see potential futures of this, whether there's a potential in grassroots organization of commodity producers, or if there's not really much of a future in commodity production for export in cash crops.
Take it. Any other questions or respond? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important question, but there's no reason why, if you're producing a nickel, that it should leave the country before it becomes a battery. There's no reason why, if you're producing cashew nuts, that you aren't entirely processing, roasting them, and shipping them around the country. There's no reason why, if you're producing cocoa, that you can't produce the best chocolate in the world in Africa. And that's what really has to occur. That's just a starting point. These are kind of what I call low-hanging fruits. And so, whenever I go to African countries, I was just in I was just in Uganda, and I said, I'm not leaving without buying Uganda chocolate bars produced from Uganda cocoa. And they're good. And it's a wonderful thing. I distributed them at quality time and everything. And, I did it in Cote d'Ivoire and all these places. And you go along and you say, what can be done here? Coffee. Why is coffee not being roasted and shipped around the world? Why aren't African countries setting up, kicking Starbucks out and producing their own chains, producing the best coffee? Because Africa has, sorry guys, I mean, Indonesia's good, but there's nothing better than Ethiopian coffee, right? That's where it all started. So, sorry, it's my bias. I mean, and there's a long list of things in which Africa could control the entire value chain. Why is it that they're producing cotton and not producing final goods? I had a long history of visiting Ati River in Kenya, right, which is a big export zone, but a long time part of the Kenya Export Processing Zone Authority, right? I've been traveling here, I can't remember when I was first there, sometime in the 90s maybe, and it blew me away because in all of Kenya, they didn't have a single company that could do weaving. So under AGOA, you had an opportunity to sell tax-free textiles, right? But they didn't have a single company, so all the value added was going to China. So every time, and Obama did it most recently, they had to have a waiver of sourcing, because under AGOA, you're supposed to use either American products or African products. And so they had to get the waiver to use Chinese products. Well, 80% of the value of the added was going to China. That's insanity. And so why were they not having their own, and I sat there interviewing, and it was partly a policy decision. These neoclassicals saying, export processing zone. This was the great problem. I wrote a paper on this. They saw export processing zones as a second best solution to free trade. What nonsense. I mean, it should have been seen as an opportunity for utilizing your own products. I was there once and they said, we've got to stop producing. I'll come back to the weaving question in a second. We've got to stop selling unprocessed hides, right? But what did they do? So we're putting a tax on hides. This was insanity. In the export processing zone, they said that's really outside the country. So hence, if you're going to use Kenya hides, you have to pay a tax on it. Insanity. So it's better to get kind of hides from other countries. This was the nonsense, because of these neoclassical economists. They're saying the best is free trade. If we can't have it, we're going to try to reproduce free trade, things going in and out without any constraint as an export processing zone. Instead of saying, what are the incentives to utilize more local products? And so I was talking to the biggest manufacturer there, company that was Taiwanese based, and the guy running it was a guy from Mauritius, a really interesting, smart guy, spent a lot of time in Africa. And I said to him, I said, if the government put restrictions and said, you can't participate in AGOA without having your own weaving, would you do it? He said, yes. But no government has sat there and said, we need to rethink what we're doing in this place. And it's just a failure of the economists and the others thinking it through. So what I'd argue is that commodity dependence is something that can be overcome with a proper policy and a set of configurations, I mean, one other quick example. So the Kenyans and East Africans said, we're sick and tired of secondhand clothing. We're going to ban it. Anybody hear the story? You know the story? The US said, if you ban secondhand clothing, which is a huge source of charitable money that's earned for them, we will penalize you with a cut and aid. And so they had to give in. They couldn't do it because they said, okay, the best thing to do is that's undercutting our ability to produce products for our own country. It was, sorry guys, that's pure imperialism. And so the mechanisms there, but also understanding the constraints. Historically, we've always known that the North always had much higher tariffs and protection on anything that had any processing on it, but they could import duty-free commodities, and that's also remembering what the structure is internationally, and that can never be forgotten.
I wanted, sorry, I'm talking too much, sorry. I wanted just, I mentioned, I was actually processing a thought on the failures and challenges with these policies from the neoliberal policies. And I was actually going to ask myself, what could be the solution? Because if we start with structural adjustments, it failed in Africa. In fact, it impoverished Africans the more. We had Millennium Development Goal, the very recent one. It also failed in most parts of Africa. It did elevate some few communities out of poverty. I am interested in more on this study because actually this is actually an area I have done personal studies on, and I've actually seen a lot on. I want to ask, what do you think, having gone through these rural communities in most parts of Tanzania and Uganda, what do you think would be the best way out of government planning, as in policies wise? And then for value at the level of value chains rather, apart from setting up, like a prof rightly mentioned, the issues with environment and others that might affect industrialization in Africa, what would you think would be the best solution for rural communities with the impact of climate change, which you rightly mentioned, the loss of land, and there has been floodings, there has been droughts, there has been lots of other environmental issues that the communities are actually suffering from. And I'm working with a team in Nigeria, and we're doing a study on different communities in Nigeria. We've done 18 states in Nigeria, 26 states, and we realize that most of what is being reported is far less than what is real on ground. And we actually are left with this, or rather I am personally left with this thought of what could be the panacea to the situation in most rural communities, because they would their dependence on the states has actually never helped them, has currently not helped them, because most times the state brings up policies that do not actually help them. They bring up privatization and they sell up their lands. They force them to lose their lands where there are natural resources and all that. What do you think would be a solution? I was thinking of maybe a rebellion against the state that would help them. But on the other thought, we think that would not even help them, because there has been communities who have rebelled against the states, and all the states could do, rather than sitting and discussing with them conflict management strategies, they rather would send the military and the police to shoot at the villagers. And at the end of the day, there are loss of lives, and the aim is not achieved. What do you think would be the solution to the situation or plight of rural communities in most parts of Africa?
That's a huge question, and there's multiple components in it. You know, everything from the view of the state as the enemy, and problematic and security issue, all the way to the issue of the trust of the state to do anything that's positive, all to the issue of how do we deal with climate change, and then how do you actually then transform the rural communities. And so let me take it bit by bit.
Okay.
So let me begin with the issue of climate change. And I study this, and I teach a lot about this I took a look at the health implications in Africa of climate change, which is huge. But the most important thing that can be done in Africa now is they've had these mass campaigns, for example, immunization against measles, which have been very successful. You know, there really needs to be a mass campaign done cooperatively with dealing with water management. And there's two components to that. One is you've got to start dealing with storage systems and rainfall, and catchments, and then having that water available. And there's good technology now in being able to deal with this. That means when the rains come down, you've got to find a way to hold it and access it. And there are really simple systems. The second thing that's got to be done is you've got to put in irrigation systems. The best irrigation system we can get is a gravity irrigation system. It's low technology. It moves water simply in tapping water sources outside. It starts getting more complicated when you have to use pumps and boreholes. But ultimately, without water, either from catchments and collecting it, or from other sources of water, underground, surface water, you're in trouble. Because what we have now is a situation in which the predictability of rainfall and the vicissitudes of the standard deviation from the mean are changing dramatically in both directions. And whereas, something like 95% of all agriculture in Africa is rain-fed. That's a disaster. And that's a disaster from a human health perspective. So my perspective, I think there has to be, just as we came up with a massive measles campaign, we have to start thinking about a massive transformation in rural areas. And the other thing is, once you can provide water, you begin to change agricultural incomes, because now you can start doing multiple cropping in a year.
Yeah.
Typically, you can start doing 2 crops a year. That's a game changer in all these places. And we see it in our income analysis. Where there's irrigation, people are able to do quite well on a hectare or 2. Where people are dying from a hectare or 2 trying to survive off of rain-fed maize, or other products, and trying to predict when the rain is going to come. I mean, that's a starting point if I was to look at it. And of course, with that is electrification. And there's so many different systems of that. And we're seeing in Tanzania, we're seeing big changes, and we document this, of the arrival of electricity. And it's transformative. It's incredibly important for a whole set of different reasons, not just being able to charge up your cell phone. Yeah. Most importantly, of course, for people in Africa is being able to go to the bar and being able to watch TV and watch, and watch the World Cup and the primary. I'm joking, but that is, this is one of the great. So that's incredibly important. Now, with electrification and with reliable water sources, you have the potential for what was the backbone in places like Indonesia was in fact rural manufacturing, rural processing. Begin to start having threshing machines. You can begin to produce dried rice and doing the processing, get a greater value at it. You can begin to take your maize and begin to create sembe, in East Africa, ground maize. There's a whole series of things you can begin to look at. You can begin to roast your coffee and roast your cashew nuts. I mean, across the board, the potential for processing is huge. And then putting in mechanisms the issues of finance. I mean, what's central in this is also, until something can happen in the urban areas, you've got to find ways to create jobs in rural areas, to keep people in rural areas for now. And we know that's been successful in a lot of different places as you begin to go forward. And so these are not something we don't know about. Anybody who's read the literature in development economics, as I was raised as an IDS a long time ago, where a lot of these things started, it was in the literature in the 70s and in the 80s, and it disappeared because we had amnesia with development economics. There used to be literature on appropriate technology, the idea that technology is important in terms of what is labor intensive versus capital intensive. We've lost the history of these debates, and in some ways the updating of this literature on how the world has changed with information technology and how that's altered. Providing access to the internet is incredibly important with that information technology. But you've also started putting in healthcare systems. There's a zillion different things from the production side and the social side, which needs to transform these rural areas. But again, why aren't we having an Africa-based think tank on these issues? With a different set of tools. And this is something that we're hoping to be able to build. Starting training people to say, let's get into the real world, begin to solve these problems. Our tools are there. I could put together a course on literature on technology that came out of the 1970s and 80s of some brilliant insights in the 60s, which could be updated, but it's forgotten. And this is a part of the issue. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we need to open our minds and our imagination and our understanding of the histories that have existed in these underlying debates. But the problem is, sorry guys, None of this is in the economics departments anymore in most African countries. And I know, because I look at the literature, they're sitting there using their stupid textbooks, produced in the United States, or Europe or somewhere, the same crap. It's just amazing that my students, in the economics department, University of Michigan, are just getting the exact same curriculum as they are getting University of Dar es Salaam. It's insanity. I mean, it's bad enough in the United States, but it's even worse in these African countries, because it makes no sense. You walk outside and what world do you understand as a result of this? That's my soapbox.
Thanks a lot. I think that's a great place to leave it. We're already quarter of an hour past, and ours is a long day, but I think it's been incredibly rich for all of us. So please join me in thanking our group again. Back, and of course, we want to be back often, and for sure, many people in this room will also be back to listen to you again next year. So next time we're here. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thank you.